This is the Consciousness Podcast, and I'm your host, Stuart Preston. Each episode, I have a conversation with an expert in human consciousness. In this episode, I had the honor of speaking with Dr. Riccardo Manzotti. We discussed his explanation of consciousness, which he terms the spread mind. It's also the title of his book. With a background in electrical engineering, robotics, and computer science, Dr. Manzotti was a Fulbright Visiting Scholar at the Department of Linguistics and Philosophy at MIT. He's currently an associate professor in theoretical philosophy at IULM University, Milan. He's also a Google Scholar. We had a great conversation and covered the spread mind, mind-object identity, as well as virtual reality and physicalism. Please enjoy this episode with Dr. Riccardo Manzotti. So, Dr. Manzotti, thank you so much for being here on the Consciousness Podcast. I'm excited to speak to you and talk to you about your spread mind theory. So why don't we start there and give us an overview of the spread mind theory?
Okay, first of all, hi, Stuart, and thank you very much for this opportunity and for being here. It's really great.
Yeah, my pleasure. My pleasure.
My pleasure. Yes, so I've been working on a new hypothesis about the theory, about consciousness, and I like to call it a hypothesis rather than a theory, because in the end, it's really what it boils down to. So a lot of people have been looking for consciousness in the brain, and they've not been able to find it. And the reason might be that they've been looking in the wrong place. So as an engineer, a computer scientist, an AI scholar, and also a philosopher, I was obsessed. Why don't we find anything like consciousness inside, say, a computer or inside the brain? If it's there, there should be something that looks like consciousness. But as you very well know, no one so far has been able to find anything remotely alike conscious experience inside brains. So, how is that? And I took into consideration a radical idea, but a radical hypothesis, which is completely compatible with science. And this is something I want to stress. My hypothesis is an empirical hypothesis that is 100% compatible with physics and science. And the idea is that we haven't found consciousness inside brains because consciousness is not made of neurons, is made of objects. Which objects? The objects, the physical objects that we find in our conscious experience. So just let me make it just one example, and then I will let you ask anything you want to ask me.
Perfect.
When I see an object, when I see, let's say, an apple, that's my favorite example. When I see an apple, my experience is made of something which is red, round, and appleish. If we look inside the brain, we don't find anything like that. Neurons are neither red nor round nor appleish. Is there anything physical which is just like our experience of the apple at that moment? And my hunch has been that there is, and it is the apple itself. So my hypothesis is that our consciousness of the world, made of objects, sky, clouds, anything you find in your own experience, is one and the same with the world itself.
Interesting. And so when you say spread mind, what does the word spread mean?
Well, the word spread came after many conversations I had with a friend of mine called Tim Parks, who is a novelist, and by the way, who has just published a book titled Out of the Head about this stuff. And he suggested that my view placed consciousness in the external world. So consciousness is not inside the mind, is not an inner domain, but it is rather spread to encompass the world that we experience every day. So he suggested the name, the spread mind. Honestly, today, I like another expression, which is the mind-object identity, which mirrors some theories about the mind, very popular in the 50s and in the 60s, that suggested an identity between the mind and the brain. I suggest a different kind of identity, which is that between mind and object.
And that's the mind-object identity that you published a paper on that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Correct. And
So
no,
sorry, go ahead.
No, I mean, I like the name mind object identity because it immediately rings a bell for neuroscientists. Because neuroscientists have grounded all of their research on the idea that there has to be something inside the brain which is identical to our experience. And therefore, they've been looking for the neural correlates of consciousness. Why? Because they were not able to find anything that was really identical with consciousness. People like Koch, people like Anil Seth, people like David Eagleman, they went for the second best, which is not something which is identical to consciousness, but something which is a good correlate for consciousness. But for a moment, think about that. Do scientists in other fields look for correlates? Do the people that have been looking for dark matter look for the correlate of dark matter, or do they look for the real thing? Do the people that have been looking for the Higgs boson happy with finding a correlate of the Higgs boson, or they go for the real thing? So the fact that neuroscientists, after trying to find out the neural activity which is identical to consciousness, have decided to backtrack to looking for a correlate is suspicious. It tells us something, and probably tells us that they're looking in the wrong place. So when I use the word mind-object identity, this is a clear signal to neuroscientists that I am using their own method, only I am taking into consideration a different hypothesis.
Yeah, that makes sense. And so you're looking at the phenomenal experience as being a property of the object.
Exactly.
Okay. Now, when you just kind of a tangential comment or thought, when you mentioned that consciousness is in the object, it sounds like this Buddhist concept of become one with something that you love, or become one with an object. Have you explored that at all? Has anybody approached you with that concept, or done kind of a cross spiritual religion philosophy combination with what you're talking about to see if there's not something there?
Yes, well, I must confess that I don't know anything about Eastern philosophy, and that I moved from a completely physicalist and I would say logical and rational in the Western sense background. But having said
that makes sense.
Yeah, but having said that, many people pointed to me that there is a connection between there are analogies between my hypothesis and the teachings of Eastern thinker. And from the little I know, I think that if I could, of course that's not possible, but if I could, I would really like to spend time with Buddha and other Eastern thinker to talk about what they meant for consciousness. And it may turn out that what they meant was very much alike what I mean, as many people have pointed to me. So although I don't know anything, I would very much like to have a, of course, impossible conversation with them.
Right. Yeah, that would be interesting. So if that happens, I'll keep an eye on that from you. So, I hear you saying that you're not looking for a neural correlate of consciousness, the way you wouldn't look for a physical correlate of dark matter. But as we actually have these phenomenal experiences as a property of an object, what is the connection in our brain, in our minds, to the consciousness coming from this object with which we're interacting?
Right. Well, of course, the brain is necessary in order to have conscious experience. We have plenty of data that show that there's a very intimate connection between the activity in the brain and our consciousness. If we damage the brain, we change the way in which we experience the world. If we take drugs, have different experiences. If our brain goes in a different state, we dream or we have hallucination. So all the empirical evidence from neuroscience points out to a causal relation between the brain and and consciousness. However, it has never been proved that the consciousness is inside the brain, nor that, and this is very important, that the brain is sufficient for consciousness. Let me make you an example. We have no evidence at all that a congenitally total color blind subject can have an experience or a dream or a hallucination of color. Likewise, we have no evidence at all that a congenitally total blind subject have anything like an experience of a visual image. There's plenty of evidence that it shows that they may have images, tactile images. They may have geometrical images. They may have the concept of a shape. But this is not the same as having a visual experience. So, as far as we know, the idea that the brain is able to create its own reality is a myth. The very popular image of the brain in a vat, that because it has been connected with a computer from its birth, like in the Matrix movie, just to make an example, and that therefore is able to create a mental world undistinguishable from the real world, is a myth, is a contemporary myth, is a legend. And by a legend, I mean something that we have no evidence that it might be true. And let me make you another example that it is always misleading. The notion of virtual reality, that many people take as a proof that the brain may create its own reality. Let me ask you a question, Stuart. I don't know, have you ever used a virtual reality device?
I have.
Okay, great. And so probably you saw virtual images.
Yes. Yeah, saw images and traveled and went places.
Great. And so you saw colors inside those images.
I did.
Okay, so my question is, were the colors that you saw virtual, or were they real physical colors produced by a little tiny screen inside your virtual reality device?
Yeah, they were real colors.
Exactly. The fact is that all virtual reality devices don't work by inducing our brain into creating a mental reality. They work because they produce little tiny physical, this is what I want to stress, physical properties next to our sensor organs. So they produce little tiny images just in front of your eye. They produce little sounds, tiny sounds just next to your ears. They move your body a little bit, maybe, and so forth. So we have no evidence that we can produce a mental world. All the examples that we have since the time in which Penfield started in the 50s to trigger electric activity in the brain up to the most advanced virtual reality devices show that the physical world is necessary and that the brain always works because it is coupled with the external physical reality, which recombine but does not create. And that's the crucial point, I think.
Okay. And so I can see the colors in the virtual reality, but the phenomenal experience of it, the qualia that come along with that experience, is coming out of the physical device of the virtual reality machine. And that phenomenal experience in me can create physical reactions. So what is the connection? How does the consciousness come from the physical object and end up in my physical body.
Okay, that's a very good point. So you say that you get some interaction with the physical external property, and that you have to explain where your phenomenal experience, the qualia, is triggered by, or how is it created by the physical external property. But let me ask you another question. Have you ever seen, let's say, a physical red next to a phenomenal red? To be able to say, okay, one is physical and the other one is phenomenal. I don't think so.
No, but I mean, I guess the phenomenal experience is I feel red, right? I mean, if I see red on the abdomen of a black widow,
yes,
I feel a phenomenal feeling. It's a conscious feeling of that I can't, it's not a physical thing, but somehow, so that black widow is the object, and I have a phenomenal experience. The conscious is of the object. It's of the spider.
Yes.
So how is that connected to me? How does the consciousness actually end up being connected into my experience? How do I experience that consciousness?
Yes, I will get to that.
It's not
in a
neural.
moment. Exactly, I will get to that in a moment. But since you picked up this example, let me tell you that I've just been, not just, a year ago, I've been bitten by a black widow with that black and red on a finger. Well, it wasn't that bad because it was a dry bite. It was not a wet bite, so not a lot of poison. And you guess where? At the airport, at the Logan International Airport in Boston. So that was not a particularly exotic place to be beaten by.
No.
So anyway, I have that red very, very clear in my experience. So good. So you see, what does it mean when we say that I feel red? So I take this sentence to as the working example. I feel red, and I would say that in this sentence, we don't know what is the I. We don't know what is the feeling, which is a relation between something we don't know what it is, the I, and the red. And the only thing that maybe we know what it is the red. And where is the only place where we know the red is? It's the back of the black widow. The back of the black widow is the only place where we are sure there is something red. So my hunch is that when we say something like, I feel the red on the back of the black widow, what we really mean is something like the red on the back of the spider is part of myself. I am composed by the property which is physically on the back of the black widow. So the idea is that there's no such a thing as a homunculus inside my body waiting for the colors to be reproduced inside my body. But rather, my body is at the center of a world, and the properties of this world at any time may be part of the collection of events, which is myself. At any moment, at this very moment, Stuart, what do you have in your experience but my voice? I mean, in your, I don't know, are you in a studio, in a room, on a terrace? Where are you?
Yeah, I'm in a room. Yeah, okay. I'm in a room.
So what do you see? Some shelves, a wall,
window.
What else? Window,
computer, table.
Exactly. So you see, if I ask, what do you find inside your experience? You're not telling me about mental stuff. You are telling me about the world which surrounds your body. I asked you, what do you find in your experience? And you told me a window, a table, shelves, walls. You didn't tell me an image of a window, an image of a wall, an image of a phenomenal experience, a qualia of a table. You told me, a table. And if I may say, I believe that we have been all bamboozled by this talking about qualia and about phenomenal experience, because we assumed we were where our body is. And because we couldn't find anything like our world inside our body, we invented the idea that inside our body there had to be a miniature replica of the external world. And we call that replica, that copy, qualia. And we said that it has to be phenomenal because we cannot see it. I cannot open your body and find your experience. But like in the fable about the emperor's new clothes, we didn't concluded that because we couldn't find anything like our experience inside our body, our experience had to be elsewhere. We draw the conclusion that our experience had to be inside our body, but had to be invisible, phenomenal, something which is spatial, unique. It's there, but nobody can see it. Isn't that strange to assume that there is something inside our body that nobody can see, can observe, can physically measure?
Yeah, I mean that is essentially the hard problem, isn't it? Is we have these phenomenal experiences, but like you said, we can't find it in the body or in the mind, in the brain. I mean,
I know. That's why I ask people to turn upside down their world, rather than think they are inside their body and they perceive the world. I ask them to consider, what if it was the other way around? What is, we are the world, and we are the world that acts through our body. So the body is the proxy for the world that we are. It's not the proxy of a brain. It's the proxy of the external world. What is the role of the brain then? The role of the brain is to bring together a world. The role of, exactly. If you think about that, I mean, because of your brain in your body, a whole world of things in your life adds up, and they produce effects through your body. A weeks later, a minute later, in different places. So our body is a kind of funnel. It's a funnel through which the external world is able to act and to produce events.
And so these objects that contain the consciousness, as you put it, and you almost have to strip away all the typical verbiage and definitions, you know, with your hypothesis. But when we look at that, I'm looking at an apple, and I have the phenomenal experience of the apple as a property of the apple. What if you're looking at the same apple? You know, we obviously, I think I read somewhere, or maybe in one of your videos, you mentioned how we both are experiencing that apple in different ways, right? I mean, maybe my side of the apple isn't quite ripe, so it's a little yellow. Your side is red, and we're looking at it differently. Yes. But that apple it's the consciousness from the apple is connected into both of our beings.
Yes, this is an excellent question, which is at the basis of at the roots of the debates about consciousness ever since Plato. I mean, if one is a realist and like me, I even claim that we are one and the same with external objects. How is that? We all see the world in a different way. I may be colorblind, and you may be not colorblind. So, or I may, you know, when we enter in a room, it might be ghastly hot for you, and it might be chilly for someone else. So how is that if the world is what we are made of, we all experience a different world? Now, interestingly enough, the answer is already in Newtonian physics. It is even in Galilean physics, so it is in the very fabric of reality. But for some reason, nobody has ever paid too much attention to it. And I refer to a very simple fact that we all learn at school. And we may call it the relative nature of physical properties. But this sounds like a big mouthful. Let me make you a much simpler experiment. Velocity. Much simpler example. Velocity. If you take an object, let's take the apple. So we started talking about the apple. Let's continue to talk about the apple. If I put an apple on your table right now, and I ask you, is this apple still or moving? You would reply to me, well, Riccardo, it is still relative to the table. But, for example, it is moving relative to the moon. And it is moving at another velocity relative to a car that is passing in front of the building in which you are. So, the point is, velocity does not exist by itself. Velocity is a physical property, but it is a relative physical property. So, the same object may have multiple velocities, and they're all physical. And this is not an issue for physics. It's not that physics collapsed after Galileo's discovery of the relativity of velocity. It is just a fact that we learn at school that all velocities are relative. If we accept that...
Yeah, it's your physical frame of reference.
Exactly. They're relative to a reference frame. Perfect. We can apply the same argument to all other properties. For example, colors. I may say that a patch or a white patch is white only relative to a standard trichromat, namely someone with the same number of and kind of photoreceptor that an average human being has. But if one had a different eye, one would see a different color. Not because one would see a mental color, but because, as in the case of velocity, colors are relative. They're relative to a reference frame. In the case of velocity, it is all very simple because it's all explained by geometry. In the case of colors, we need to consider more complex causal chains. We need to take into consideration the geometry of the eye, of the retina, the number of receptors, the absorption curves of the receptors, and so forth. So color is not an easy property. But in the end, we cannot define a color without specifying relative to which physical system that color is gonna be. And we can say the same about everything. Take a sunset, for example. You are on the beach. You watch the sea. I live in Italy, in a place where the sun sets in the sea. It's very nice. So every night we have these beautiful sunsets, and every night, every evening, we can see the line of the sun on the sea. My point is that sunset is relative to a particular human body. If we moved on the beach, we would see that the sunset would move together with us. As it can happen if you're driving. If you're driving, when the sun sets down, you will see that the sun seems to follow you. But it's not because the sun follows you, but because the sunset is a relative physical object. So to cut a long story short, the idea is that we can explain the subjectivity of experience in terms of physical relativity. There's no need to have a subjective reality. It is enough to understand that the physical world is relative. And because we all have different bodies, it's like velocity. If you're all walking in a different direction and at a different speed, every object would have a different velocity relative to us. I just ask you to consider that the world is much richer than it seems. That's why I call it the physical world, with an expression that I like very much, a rainbow world. To mean that all objects have multiple properties, like a rainbow which has multiple colors. I suggest that every object surrounding us has many more colors than the one that we see. We see only the color that takes place relative to our particular physical body. But such a color is not in our head. It's outside, like relative velocity.
Yeah. What about, and I'm not sure if this is what you meant, but you used an expression, privacy of experience, and I think I misunderstood that. But what it made me think of is, what about experiences that are purely inside of my head? So like a dream or a hallucination, a thought. What about phenomenal experiences that don't necessarily have an external object?
Right. Well, this is a crucial question, and it is probably the crux of the matter. It is the question that induced many philosophers, starting from Plato and going through Descartes, to introduce the notion of a mental world, the idea of an immaterial soul. Because how could explain the fact that I can see something that is not there? Well, my answer to that is twofold. First of all, it's not completely true that we can really experience everything. Our imagination is heavily constrained. For example, you cannot imagine by sheer imagination, you cannot see by sheer imagination a color you've never met. If you try hard to see a color which is neither red nor green nor blue nor violet, you're not going to succeed. So first of, and that I think is quite interesting. If all these qualities were created by our mind, why should not be able to create additional ones? After all, it shouldn't be more difficult than create the one that we see every day. Think about everything that might go wrong in a brain in terms of diseases, trauma, chemical substances. If we had the machine, so to speak, that creates qualia, why does it never make a mistake and create a color that we've never seen? Isn't that surprising? So
yeah. So even if I dream of if I have a nightmare of a monster that I've never seen before, the monster is really constructed of things that were already in my brain.
Exactly. And this is surprising if our brain created the qualia. Because sooner or later, I would expect my brain, no matter how good it is, to make a mistake. You know, maybe because of disease, maybe because I have high fever. I don't know. But I mean, take genes. Sometimes people are born with additional fingers. They have additional physical features. Sometimes genes make mistake. The brain is a lot more complex than genes. We have 100,000 genes, but we have trillions of connections in the brain. If the brain created qualia, why the brain never makes a mistake? Why colors are always right? Why the stuff our mental world is made of is always the stuff the physical world in which we live is made of? that should raise some questions, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Exactly.
So then our brains end up with these impressions. Is that what it is? So I experience the apple. The apple has the consciousness, and I experience that and it leaves an impression on my brain. Is that, I guess, a memory?
Exactly. Well, I'm trying to get rid of the
Is it
notion.
that simple?
Well, yes, I think that is a too simplistic notion of memory. And I suggest a different notion of memory. And I will take advantage of another author that might surprise you, who claims something very close to what I'm going to suggest as an explanation of memory. And this author is Claude Shannon, the founder of the theory of information and basically the founder of AI. He's not as famous as Alan Turing, but actually Claude Shannon, who was Nobel Prize, was the guy that really created the basis for computer science and AI. So he's really a key figure. And he was working with memories and with artificial memories for the first time. And all of a sudden, Shannon had a revelation in one of his books and working with memories. He said, memory is just slow communication. So imagine that I am sending a signal through a wire, and imagine that I can slow down the signal at an arbitrary slow speed along the way. And imagine that I can decide when the signal gets back to the original speed. So I send you, let's say, some signal, I send you some information, and along the way, the speed of this information slows down enormously. And it's still there.
It's buffered.
Exactly. Well, but the buffer is the notion that you store the information into some kind of container. The point that Shannon wanted to make is that we don't need the notion of the buffer. It is enough to be able to slow down information. So information is never really still. It keeps moving, only at an incredibly slow speed. Well, Shannon said, if we can do that, we can explain memory as a form of very slow communication. So you have a pen drive. I send you information. The information gets inside your pen drive. It takes, say, a year in order to be transferred to your computer. And you may say that you had a memory on your pen drive, but Shannon would have said that that was just a case of very, very slow communication. So why do I say that? And what does it have to do with hallucination and memory? Because if we accept that notion, we may explain memory and hallucination as cases of very slow perception. So as in communication, we have a source and then we have a receiver. In perception, we have an external object and then we have an experience. Usually, we think that there has to be something in between, and we call it a record or an engram. But no one has ever been able to find in a brain anything like a record. If you read all of the literature in neuroscience about memory, we find a lot about neural signals, but nothing like a neural record. No one has ever been able to find out the record of, say, one's grandmother. Only neural structure which are related with a continuous flow of information from the inside to the outside and keep going. Actually, it's interesting that we cannot switch off a brain. Brain, are not the kind of thing that you can stop. the neural signals in the brain continue to move. So we could take advantage of Claude Shannon's insight about the nature of memory, and we could say that memory in a brain is just slow perception. We still perceive something, only it took to us years to perceive it, rather than what happens in everyday life when the distance between what we perceive and the activity in the brain is 100 milliseconds.
Right.
I know, it sounds very, very different from what we are used to think about.
It is.
But it provides,
it is very different.
I know, but at least it provides a new answer to a question that has never had a convincing solution.
Yeah, that's interesting. I wanted to go back a little bit, the frame of reference. So you mentioned the velocity of the apple and the frame of reference.
Please.
If we take this, the apple has, I'm experiencing the mind object of the apple. Can I flip it around? And I guess the two parts of the question. One is, does my physical, the physical property of consciousness within my physical body, does the apple experience that? And the other part of that is, if you and I are sitting together, or even here on the phone, are our mind objects interacting together?
Yes, well, that's a very good question, because a lot of people take that point wrong. They say, if I see the apple, therefore, if I am the apple, when I see the apple, then the apple is me, so it is watching at me. No, I never said that apples have an experience of people watching at them. And that's why I have a brain and the apple doesn't have a brain. So to allow the apple to take place relative to a reference frame, we need the proper reference frame. In this case, the body with the brain is the right reference frame for the apple to be what it is.
Mm-hmm.
The apple doesn't have, there's no symmetry here. The apple doesn't have any proper structure like my brain. So the apple is not in any condition to be responsible for the experience of my body, my face, whatever I am when I'm looking at the apple. Let me put it this way. I claim that the body and the brain are the necessary condition for the apple to exist. So they allow the apple to be what it is. But, and the apple is also one and the same with my consciousness. So I am identical with the apple and I exist because of my brain. But the brain is not the thing that I am. The brain, or the neural activity in the brain, is only the necessary condition for the thing that I am to take place. An analogy is the following. Take a lake in the mountains and an artificial dam. So if you build a dam, say in Switzerland, there's a lot of rain, there's a lot of water, the terrain is steep, so it's very likely that you get a lake. It's very easy to make a lake in Switzerland. But
right,
if you build a dam in the Saudi Arabia desert, there's no water, there's no rain, there are no mountains. Doesn't matter whether you build a 1 mile high dam, you're not gonna get any lake.
Right.
So the dam is responsible for the existence of the lake, but it's not the lake. Likewise, I say that the brain is responsible for the existence of my experience, but such an experience is not in my brain. It is somewhere else, where it is one and the same with the apple, when my experience is made of the apple. Now, I don't want to be misleading. I use the example of the apple just because it is easy and simple, but of course, at any moment, my experience, your experience, is not made just by one object. But as you said before, it's made by your room, the people that are walking back and forth in your place, is made by what happened to you a week before, a few days ago. But if you put together all that stuff, that collection of objects, which is of course more complex than an apple, that collection of objects is what you find in your mind. At this very moment, it's just the lake that your body is preventing from flowing down, from scatter everywhere. So in a way, the brain is a physical device that allow a whole world of objects, bodies, animals, events to take place together. It joins together as a reference frame a whole world. It provides unity to a whole world, which remains there. We have to resist to the temptation of imagining, of thinking that this world is brought inside the brain. Nothing gets inside the brain. The brain is physically insulated from the external world. The world remains outside, but the brain allows that world to produce effects.
And that's why you would call yourself a physicalist, which I find interesting, because it's like a mind and object, you know, it almost seems there's still a separation between mind and brain here in the old sense, but the way you're talking, the mind-body identity, it does seem like it makes sense that you would call yourself a physicalist, and I know that, your claim that consciousness is not inside the brain, like you just said, there's a physical separation there, and therefore not in our bodies. How are both of those true?
Yeah, that's a very good point. I mean, actually, ever since 18th century, people contrasted the body with the soul. And they thought that if you don't believe in the soul, therefore, the only option was to believe that we are only our bodies, that we are one and the same with our body. The common view, the popular view, is that a physicalist, a materialist, is someone who believes that we are identical with our bodies. We can be anything else. But actually, this is completely false. It is false from a scientific perspective, because to be a physicalist is only to believe that everything is physical. Not that if we are physical, therefore we have to be our bodies. A physicalist has to believe only, or to assume only, that if we are physical, we have to be identical with something physical, no matter where this something is located. So when I claim that we are the external object, the external world, I make a claim that is perfectly compatible with physicalism. Because the thing that I suggest we are identical with is made of physical objects. Tables, chairs, apples, people, and so forth. And as I said, it is also false from a common sense point of view. In fact, we don't say, I am a body. I say, I have a body. We don't say, unless we saw many science fiction movies of the last 20, 30 years, we don't say, I am a brain. That's a very recent figure of speech. Actually, for all the human history, people have said, we have a brain, we have a heart, we have a body, but we are not them. And as I said, I mean, because there seemed to be because scientists believed there was no alternative, they stress very much that if you are a physicalist, you have to believe to be one and the same with our body. But they offer an alternative. And that's something that I want to stress to neuroscientists and to scientists, that in my hypothesis, there is nothing outside of the physical world. So we can be physicalists and at the same time understand that we are not our bodies, but we are something more than that.
Yeah, that does make sense.
Thank you.
It does make sense.
Thank you very much.
Now another thing you put out there for me to look at is Tononi in his integrated information theory, which comes up quite a bit when I talk to different people. There are other computational approaches out there. When you look at these ideas and these concepts about consciousness, why is your hypothesis different? And what is the connection of your hypothesis with information?
Right. Well, Tononi put forward a very interesting hypothesis, namely that our brain produces something that nobody has ever been able to measure or to see directly, as we see, say, electric activity or other physical properties, something that he has called integrated information. And he puts forward the hypothesis that this integrated information, which is a very interesting mathematical concept, might in turn produce our conscious experience, our phenomenal experience. Now, I like to contrast my view with Tononi's hypothesis because our views couldn't be more different. They're really at the two opposite ends of a spectrum. Tononi claims that brains are unique in the natural universe, that they produce something which is impossible to be measured and observed, like we observe tables, chairs, and electricity.
Yeah.
And then he's left with additional mysteries. Even if in our brains there was something like integrated information, which is still to be proved, we would have again the same problem. How is that information becomes our colored, smelly, and rich conscious world? Because if you think about information, it doesn't look like our experience. It looks very much different, a set of bits, mathematical notions, very different from the red of the apple, and so forth. But
right.
Tononi's proposal is flattering to a traditional, albeit old view, which is the idea that human beings are special, that we are at the center of the universe, that we are different from the other animals, and that in our brain happens something which is different from the physical world. This is what Sigmund Freud called the narcissism of man, namely our tendency to believe that we have to be special, that we can't be just like the external world. We want to be at the center of everything. We want to be made of a stuff which is not the same stuff tables and chairs are made of. Yeah. So in order to justify that, Tononi's theory is coherent with this view, which failed completely in other areas. I mean, Darwin showed that we are not special. We are just like the other animals. I mean, we're all made by DNA. Copernicus showed that we are we are not in a special place in the universe. We are not at the center of the universe, and so forth. So, against this view, I put forward an opposite view, which claims that we are just like the world. We're not made of a special information concocted inside the brain. We are just made of the external world. We are one and the same with the world. So although it is a little bit less flattering, because the consequence of my hypothesis is that we're made of the same stuff everything else is made of. At the same time,
we are stardust.
We are stardust. Exactly. That's not a bad thing after all. It is also, in a way, more relaxing, because we are not prisoner of our mind. We cannot be cheated by a matrix demon making us believe to be in the universally in a massive simulation. If my theory is right, the massive simulation hypothesis by Nick Bostrom and other people is just wrong. We see the world as it is. The world we see is not an illusion created by our brain. It is just the world. And this is, for me, it is reassuring. I like the idea that there's no separation between myself and the world.
Yeah, it does make sense, and it does feel right. What about your hypothesis connection with information?
Well, I will use again Claude Shannon's word, and Claude Shannon being the guy who invented the theory of information, I think he knew what he was talking about. Claude Shannon said that information doesn't have anything to do with the semantic aspect of experience. This is to say that information is not a stuff in the world. It is a way we have to describe with what computers or people do when they interact in a certain way. Let me give you an analogy.
Yes.
A year ago, a friend of mine was convinced that inside food there are calories as there are proteins and carbohydrates. And they tried to explain to him that while proteins and carbohydrates are stuff which can be extracted and separated in the food, calories are not a stuff. You cannot find 1 calorie through chemical processes. Calories are what the stuff inside the food does, but it's not a stuff. It's a different notion. Well, information, to cut a long story short, is like calories. Is what the stuff a computer is made of can do. So you can store 1 billion questions inside a memory. But those questions are not inside that memory. They're just like calories.
Yeah, that makes sense. I just have a few more wrap-up questions here, but before I get into those, was there anything specific to your hypothesis that I haven't asked or that you wanted to get out there?
No, I think we've been pretty comprehensive, and I thank you very much, because you asked me the most important thing, and I would not have been able to be clearer than I've been without your question. So thank you very much.
Well, great, and thank you for your help with those. So just a few wrap-up things. Kind of big picture, what do you see as being potential big ramifications of your hypothesis?
Well, first of all, I think it might help neuroscience to devise experiment completely different from the one that they're doing right now, to understand what is consciousness, and possibly to addresses diseases and conditions which are related with our conscious experience. Moving from wrong assumption about something so important as consciousness has dire consequences for research, and also for the application of research. Continue to think that we have to find out a genie among neurons is wasting money and time that we could apply to do completely different research. It's a little bit like when in the 19th century physicists got stuck with the notion of ether, and they've been trying to find ether for 60 years. They devised
Right.
the smartest and the most ingenious experiment to find ether, only to find out that there was nothing to find. And so the
Right.
first impact would be in science. The second impact might be, I think, in everyday life, because it will help us to get rid of the notion of being a ghost in the shell, of being something prisoner in the body. And it also, I think, will make a big impact on society, because people might stop giving all that importance to their own body. Because right now we think that we are our bodies, contrary to what our language says, that we have bodies, but we are not our bodies. But once we will understand that we are the world that our body brings into existence, then we will care more for others and for the environment in general, and not because of altruism, but because we will understand that the surrounding world is what we are made of. And so, in a way, this theory will provide a kind of a selfish argument for altruism. So, if we are the others, then it makes sense to be good with the others, and not only because we are altruist, but because it's what we're made of. So I think it will have a big impact on both science and everyday life.
Yeah, I think that's a great use of this hypothesis. It's almost, you grow up and they teach you are what you eat. It's almost taking that and say you are where you are. You are the environment, and so it's if you make that better, you make yourself better, and you make each other better.
Exactly.
That's fantastic.
The old idea that we cannot. I think this is one of the few things that I know about Buddha. So, but this is a very scholastic memory. That you cannot save only yourself. That you can't save only yourself. And that's strange if you accept the traditional Western view of man, because we believe to be completely isolated from the universe. So if we accept the traditional view of man as a ghost in the shell, once the shell is intact, we don't care about the universe, about the world, about the others, because we are just a ghost in the a very lonely and sad and bleak ghost in the shell. So according to that view, we could survive inside the memory of a computer, but that would be a very sad existence, because we would be completely insulated, sealed from the world.
Yeah.
I suggest a completely different view, and I provide a logical explanation of Buddha's suggestion that you can't save yourself alone, because you don't exist alone.
Right.
I'm saying something very strong, that what we are is the others, but not in a moral sense, in a physical sense. So I'm providing a physicalist support for being one with the rest of reality. And because we are a social organism, social individual, to be one with the others.
Yeah, that's a very powerful notion, and actually, I'm not sure if you intended to set out for that, but it's a very beautiful notion.
It's something that I stumbled upon. It was a consequence, an unpredicted consequence of a very scientific and in a way cold process of singling out various solutions to the problem of consciousness. But I've been very happy to find out something so heartening for me at the end of a process that was not looking for anything like that.
Okay. All right. Well, let's finish up with this one. What else is in your future? What are you going to be working on? And, along with that, kind of what do you see in the future of the study of human consciousness?
Well, in the next future, I want, first of all, to address, and I've already started doing that. And in my book, you will find a lot of evidence from neuroscience, but I want to continue to do that. I want to look for empirical evidence of this framework. And strangely enough, I'm looking for this empirical evidence in the work of neuroscientists. And I will work probably with some neuroscientists in order to make experiments that make prediction about conscious experience. So I will be working a lot more on the empirical verification of my theory, because as I said, it's a scientific hypothesis. It's not a philosophical speculation. It is a scientific
I like that aspect.
And it's just that it may sound, let's say, so radical that people may say, well, it doesn't look like the average hypothesis that neuroscientists put forward. And I do agree with that. But having said that, it is 100% a scientific empirical hypothesis with many consequences. But it's just like that. So I will work a lot about finding empirical verification of this hypothesis. And I will probably try to devise experiment. We've been already working on one of them, and we could get some result in which we will try to make people extend their own experience to completely new physical phenomena. So new color, just to make an example, or something completely alien. And not because we will give people drugs, but because we will put people in some kind of physical contraction that will allow their body to be connected, to expand to new phenomena in the world. So again, I will work on the empirical verification of this theory.
Nice. I like that. Well, Dr. Manzotti, you really have shared some incredible information, and you've got me excited to go forward and start thinking of some of how it applies in my own thoughts and my own philosophies here. So I can't thank you enough for taking your time, taking an hour out of your day to share all this with me and our listeners. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes. Can I say one last thing that I forgot to?
Oh, yeah, please. Please.
Well, sorry. I should have said it before, but I remembered right now. Sorry for that. I apologize. Since this is a very new idea, and which is related not only to scientific problems, but it also has an impact on everyday people's life. In my free time, I drew some cartoons and comics that present these problems, these ideas in a different way. They're very short, and they can be downloaded for free from my website. And I just suggest to people that are not scientists or philosophers to have a look at them, because they could see many of the problems that are related on consciousness presented in a different way. So they can just check on my website, www.consciousness.it, just to download some free cartoons, just to see whether my ideas may make sense for them.
Yeah, awesome. That's fantastic. I'm glad you got that out there, because I think that having some simple cartoons and whatnot to help us understand it is wonderful. So I will make sure and put a link to that on the podcast blog, and I will also make sure to put a link to your book and so that people can go out there and get a copy of the book and then get more information from your website. So thank you very much for making sure we got that out there.
Thank you so much. That
concludes another edition of the Consciousness Podcast. Thanks again for listening. Please find us at Facebook at facebook.com/The Consciousness Podcast, at our Twitter handle at Conchcast, and don't forget to subscribe to our feed at theconsciousnesspodcast.com. Thank you for listening.